Donald Trump won the election and is headed back to the White House next year, and that could mean massive policy changes. And whether you're on one side of the aisle or the other, the big question is, what does this mean for your early retirement? Because you don't want to ignore them when they do get finalized over the next few years. So in this video, I'll walk you through the potential impacts on markets, healthcare, taxes, and inflation, and how you can best plan for them in terms of your own early retirement. So let's start with the first question, and this may be on your mind, but how is this new administration going to impact your ability to find health insurance when you retire before Medicare? Now, something that seems to be inevitable that you need to know about is the impact on your health insurance premiums starting next year if you're on the marketplace, right? KFF, and it's a pretty good source for health insurance research. It goes through 3 potential changes that we can talk about here. The first change is Biden-era enhanced ACA subsidies are likely to expire in 2025. Basically, these were extra subsidies for those during COVID to make health insurance premiums cheaper, and these credits have been pretty valuable, especially for those that have higher incomes. For example, with these enhancements, someone with $120,000 worth of income would pay about $8,000 less in premiums with the current law. The article says a renewal of these enhanced subsidies might be considered during the lame duck session, but any extension is much less likely than if Kamala Harris and the Democrats had swept the election. The second change comes down to if the House gets rid of the ACA altogether. Now, the article talks about essentially the broader fate of the ACA hinges on House control, but it seems that the idea of completely getting rid of the ACA altogether is really not a winning issue, especially that was the case in 2017. So it's really unlikely that they do fully get rid of it. Instead, it seems maybe they could replace it or change different parts of it. So your insurance could be a lot different when you decide to retire early. And then thirdly, a potential impact comes down to regulatory changes and legal challenges to the ACA, which basically they're hinting at they may loosen the requirements for a lot of the different insurance companies to provide insurance for those on the marketplace. And the way I interpret this article is that at least for those that are planning to retire early, from a planning perspective, you might as well run scenarios for premiums with maybe less or zero subsidies. The same resource, KFF, has a calculator that you can use online to estimate what your premiums and deductibles will be based on your age, household members, and your potential income to get a really good ballpark of what your premiums could look like. Again, these are not precision, it's for ballpark estimates, and it will show you the potential premium costs and what that financial help might be. It will list the premium and the potential subsidy, and maybe for planning purposes, you don't factor in that subsidy into your budget. Another practical way to plan for this is if you're someone with a larger tax-deferred account like a 401k or an IRA, and you run Roth conversion estimates, right? Taking some of that pre-tax money, converting it to Roth. Typically, when you do this, you need to understand, especially if you retire early, there's going to be an impact on your subsidies, right? You would potentially lose a lot in subsidies if you do this. But if you were on the fence about doing Roth conversions because they would push up your income, perhaps maybe this change of law going forward may make the math a little bit more favorable in terms of Roth conversions, right? Now, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know how this is exactly going to impact you, but at least you can run some scenarios and see, hey, what potential impacts might this be and what might planning look like? Next, let's talk about markets. Now, every time a new administration takes office, there's a lot of speculation about how it will affect your investments. And this is especially if you're somebody that is retired, right? And you're going to rely on that income. But is there a clear market advantage when one party is in power versus the other? It always feels like there is, but the reality might surprise you. Our firm has managed clients' portfolios through decades of change. We've seen quite a variety of different presidents, different policies. But what is clear is that the U.S. stock market has been politically agnostic to who is in office, especially if you look at the past 100 years of markets. This chart right here is the S&P 500 going back to 1926, and there is no clear pattern in terms of who emerges to be the better person for the stock market. And to put this in perspective, just over the past 25 years of markets, they've adapted to Y2K, 9/11, a financial crisis, a pandemic, and despite all that uncertainty, we know that $1 invested in the S&P 500 in January of 1999 would have been worth more than $6 at the end of 2023. But does this mean you just sit there and do nothing with your portfolio? In fact, a fantastic thing to do with your portfolio, especially as a lot of portfolios have grown since the election and over the past past year, could be a good time to do some portfolio rebalancing. So what this means is maybe you're trimming off some of that growth and replenishing some of your cash reserve, your conservative investments, or other investments maybe haven't performed as well. And this can help you manage risk and especially be good if you're in retirement or nearing retirement and you don't yet have that right balance of cash and bonds. The next idea is a big question on my mind, as well as a lot of other financial advisors, and is what will be the impact on taxes for my clients, for you, the early retiree. And if you retire early, you don't want to miss out on good tax planning. And as the tax law changes, you or your advisor need to be aware of how this might impact you, understanding the law, understanding that the Trump tax cuts that were signed in 2017 are set to expire in 2025. But with Republican control of Congress, the question going forward is not so much whether the tax cuts will be extended, which it seems like it will, but rather what portions will remain in their current form, and will there be some wiggle room for changes in the next tax bill. Now, you can see here that under the current law, if things expired, income tax rates were set to go up, right? That would impact a majority of Americans. That would likely stay in the current law, which is good for early retirees. Long-term capital gains and qualified dividend rates would remain the same. It would avoid the standard deduction going down, which would be going down pretty significantly, which will help most people because most people now take the standard deduction. It's much higher than most people itemize. Now, what would be favorable for those that live in higher cost of living states or have higher incomes would be if it did expire, and that would be the cap on the amount of state tax you can deduct on your tax return. They call this SALT. There's a mortgage interest deduction here, but the child tax credit would have gone down. That would potentially affect a lot of early retirees who still have children. And a huge one for those that have higher net worth would be the estate tax exemption going down after expiration. Now, a lot of attorneys and high net worth clients were kind of scrambling because lowering the exemption down to $5 million would be really hefty in terms of an estate tax bill for their heirs. But another huge one is potentially, the elimination of taxes on Social Security benefits. Now, that would make a huge impact on retirees by getting rid of the 50 to 85% tax on Social Security would give a lot of older Americans a greater ability to pay for their expenses and may reduce spending on other senior programs. But again, on the other side, this might lead to implications as far as the actual funding of future Social Security, and it could lead Social Security funding to run out sooner than even expected. Now, what seems to be certain heading into 2025 is that there will be a new tax bill to either extend and or replace Trump's current tax cuts. And while it may not represent a huge shift from the status quo as it did in 2017, it could still have some tax planning implications for you and for millions of other early retirees, at least until it reaches the next sunset another 8 to 10 years from now. And lastly, what about inflation? How will inflation impact my early retirement? Now, consumers rank inflation as one of their biggest economic concerns, with many really still feeling the impact of soaring prices during the pandemic. And although inflation has fallen pretty close to the target of the Federal Reserve at 2%, many Americans still describe it as high because prices haven't come down. Rather, prices are simply rising more slowly than they did during the pandemic. And the argument that one side of the aisle is saying that slashing budgets and increasing economic growth will help reduce the impact of inflation. And I've seen a comparison with what's happened in Argentina, where in 2022, the Argentinian inflation rate was over 72%. And after slashing government spending, taxes, and increasing a focus on growth, the inflation plunged down to 2.7%, at least as of August. And that's going to be the lowest level in Argentina in the last 3 years. But on the other side, some American economists argue that tariffs will increase inflation numbers as well as reducing the workforce because of potential deportations. Now, regardless of what you think is going to happen, there is a way we can plan from this in terms of early retirement planning, because we have to not just think about the next 4 years. We have to think about the next 30 to 40 years of inflation and planning. So what do we do about this practically? This is where, rather than trying to predict inflation, you focus on what you can control, and that is your withdrawal strategy. And by focusing on that, you can be better prepared for whatever season decides to come. The problem I often see is that investments in planning is treated as uncertain and risky when it comes to retirement planning. Everyone talks about sequence of returns risk, but there's one thing that people rarely talk about. We know that a portfolio could average 8%. That's not every single year. Some years it's up, like this year, I think it's close to up 26%. But years like 2022, it was down 18%. We know that this is a factor for planning you need to account for, variable numbers and returns. But inflation is no different. Inflation might average under 2%, but that doesn't mean every year it's going to be 2%. We know this. So given the inflation we've seen recently in the US, and it hit over 9% in 2022, now is really a great time to re-examine how we treat inflation more realistically when it comes to planning. We can see that in reality, the past 100 years of inflation has been widely variable, right? Unfortunately, treating inflation as kind of a constant over financial planning does not really meet the full picture of what happens historically. It can lead to serious planning problems when it comes to what you actually expect to spend, especially for those that retire early and you retire into a high inflationary environment. The sequence of inflation rates over time really has a direct impact on your purchasing power, depending on how much a plan depends on portfolio withdrawals, could also impact your portfolio. Ultimately, the key point is that inflation is not fixed and known, it's variable and uncertain. The quality of your planning can really suffer when inflation is way too simplified. So here's kind of a high level of what you can do to plan for inflation when you retire early and what we do with clients. Now, the good news is that technology has gotten a lot better now, and now it allows us to set variable inflation. So what we do is we set inflation higher and returns lower with our near-term assumptions, so the first 10 years of retirement. And then in the later years of retirement, you set historically higher returns and historically lower inflation. Now, why would you want to do this? This could be a more realistic way to model out and set spending in a way that won't overestimate what you can spend and not underestimate the risk of inflation. Now, ultimately, the key point is that inflation is not fixed and known. It's a variable that is uncertain, and you want to have a way to plan for it. But for many of you, taxes are likely going to be your largest lifetime expense. But because of possible tax cuts and the Jobs Act extension, that means you maybe could take advantage of some of these lower rates by performing Roth conversions. I made a video breaking down in detail how you think about Roth conversions for your own retirement. You can watch that by clicking right here.